It started with little things, side-eye glances, muttered comments just loud enough to hear, and a general air of unwelcome. At first, the Johnson family tried to ignore it. After all, they had just moved into the neighborhood, and not everyone warms up to new people right away. But it didn't take long before the cold stares turned into something much worse. Their neighbor, Mrs. Parker, had lived on that street for decades, and from the moment she saw the Johnsons unloading their moving truck, it was clear she wasn't happy about them being there. She had always been the type to keep things a certain way, her way. And to her, the Johnsons, a kind, hard-working family who had done nothing wrong, simply didn't belong. At first, it was small acts of pettiness, complaints about their kids playing in the front yard, glares whenever they had guests over, even passive-aggressive notes left in their mailbox. But soon, it escalated. She started calling the city over imaginary code violations, making false noise complaints, and spreading rumors to turn the other neighbors against them. It was like she had made it her personal mission to drive them out. But Mrs. Parker didn't stop there. One morning, the Johnsons woke up to find their flower beds trampled, their car mysteriously scratched, and their garbage cans tipped over with trash strewn all over their lawn. At first, they had no proof it was her, but security cameras soon caught her sneaking onto their property in the middle of the night. It was clear she wasn't just being a bad neighbor. She was deliberately trying to make their lives miserable. Despite everything, the Johnsons stayed strong. They refused to be bullied out of their own home. They cleaned up the mess, repaired the damage, and kept living their lives with dignity. But they knew something had to be done. What Mrs. Parker didn't realize was that karma has a way of catching up to those who go out of their way to hurt others. And when it finally did, it was more satisfying than anyone could have expected. Because while she had spent so much time making the Johnsons' lives miserable, she never thought for a second that her actions would come back to haunt her. And oh, did they ever. What happened next? Well, let's just say Mrs. Parker learned a lesson she would never forget. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. For a while, Mrs. Parker thought she was untouchable. She would smirk whenever she saw the Johnsons struggling to clean up the messes she left behind. She acted as if she owned the neighborhood, as if she had the power to decide who belonged and who didn't. And because no one openly called her out, she assumed everyone was on her side. But what she didn't know was that people were watching. The other neighbors had noticed her behavior, and though some were too afraid to speak up, others had started to see her for who she really was. Quietly, conversations were happening behind closed doors. People who once ignored her antics were now whispering about the way she treated the Johnsons. Then something happened that Mrs. Parker hadn't planned for. The Johnsons decided they weren't going to sit back and let her get away with it anymore. They weren't confrontational people, but they also weren't pushovers. So instead of reacting in anger, they did something much smarter. They started keeping records. Every false complaint she made to the city, every harassing note she left, every bit of vandalism, documented. They set up cameras, saved emails, and even spoke with neighbors who had witnessed her actions. Slowly but surely, they built a case. But even as they gathered proof, Mrs. Parker continued her campaign against them, completely unaware of the trap she was walking into. She escalated her efforts, pushing harder, convinced that if she just made their lives miserable enough, they would leave. One evening, things took an even darker turn. The Johnsons returned home from dinner to find something that sent a chill down their spines. Their front door had deep scratches on it, like someone had been clawing at it. Their welcome mat was soaked with something foul-smelling. And on their porch, a broken piece of wood lay scattered, one that looked suspiciously like it had come from Mrs. Parker's fence. It was no longer just an annoyance. This was targeted harassment. That night, as they reviewed their security footage, they finally got the proof they needed. There, under the dim glow of a street lamp, was Mrs. Parker herself, creeping onto their property with a bucket in hand, pouring something onto their doorstep. The camera caught everything: her face, her actions, the way she scurried back across the street like she had done nothing wrong. The Johnsons knew this was it. This was the moment everything would change. But what they didn't know was that Mrs. Parker was about to face something even bigger than just their retaliation. Because sometimes karma doesn't wait to be served, it arrives on its own. And when it does, it hits harder than anyone ever expects. The Johnsons sat in their living room that night, replaying the footage over and over. Each time, the weight of what they had captured sank in deeper. Mrs. Parker wasn't just an annoying neighbor. She was relentless, crossing lines no decent person would ever cross. This wasn't just about property damage or petty feuds. It was about control. She wanted them gone, and she wasn't afraid to break the law to make it happen. But what she didn't realize was that the game had changed. The Johnsons weren't alone in this anymore. Quietly, without Mrs. Parker noticing, the neighborhood had started shifting. People who had once ignored her behavior were now paying closer attention. Some neighbors had their own stories, small things like rude remarks or suspiciously timed complaints. But they had brushed them off, thinking it wasn't worth the trouble. Now, seeing what the Johnsons were going through, they started connecting the dots. One of the first to reach out was Mrs. Thompson, who lived 2 houses down. She had always kept to herself, but one afternoon, she stopped by while Mr. Johnson was outside. In a hushed voice, she admitted that Mrs. Parker had been targeting her as well, though in more subtle ways. Passive-aggressive notes about her yard, strange rumors spread to other neighbors, even a complaint to the HOA about her holiday decorations. Nothing extreme, but enough to make her feel unwelcome. Then came the Simmons family, who had moved in a year before the Johnsons. They revealed that Mrs. Parker had once tried to have their fence torn down, claiming it was too high and an eyesore. The city had dismissed the complaint, but the message had been clear. She wanted control over the neighborhood, and anyone who didn't fit into her narrow view of how things should be was a target. Piece by piece, the Johnsons realized this wasn't just about them. Mrs. Parker had been doing this for years, pushing people around, making them feel unwelcome, using fear and manipulation to get her way. And then something unexpected happened. A new couple had just moved in across the street, David and Lisa, young professionals who didn't seem like the type to tolerate nonsense. Within days of settling in, they had their first run-in with Mrs. Parker. She marched over, demanding they cut down a tree in their front yard because it blocked her view. When they refused, she made a scene, yelling loud enough for the whole street to hear. But David and Lisa weren't intimidated. Instead of backing down, they did something no one else had dared to do. They recorded the whole interaction and posted it in the neighborhood Facebook group. The reaction was immediate. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years finally spoke up, sharing their own experiences. People who had once been too afraid to cross Mrs. Parker suddenly had proof that they weren't alone. And just like that, the power Mrs. Parker had over the neighborhood started to crack. But she wasn't done yet. Not even close. In fact, she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Mrs. Parker was livid. The moment she saw the video spreading through the neighborhood, she knew she was losing control. People were talking, whispering about her in ways they never had before. She had always ruled this street with quiet intimidation, but now her own neighbors were standing against her. She couldn't let that happen. Determined to shut everything down, she doubled down on her efforts. The next morning, she stormed over to the Johnsons' house, banging on the door so hard it rattled. When Mrs. Johnson answered, Mrs. Parker forced a tight-lipped smile, trying to mask her frustration. "I know you're behind all of this," she hissed, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Stirring up trouble, turning people against me. It needs to stop." Mrs. Johnson didn't flinch. She simply crossed her arms and met her neighbor's glare with quiet confidence. "The only thing that's stopping is your harassment," she replied calmly. "People are finally seeing who you really are." Mrs. Parker's face turned red, but before she could respond, the door shut in her face. That should have been the moment she realized she had lost. But instead, it only fueled her desperation. That night, something felt off. The Johnsons had gotten used to Mrs. Parker's petty antics, but this time, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like something was about to happen. Around midnight, Mr. Johnson decided to check the security cameras, a habit he had developed ever since Mrs. Parker's behavior escalated. And that's when he saw her. There she was, lurking near their driveway, her hunched figure barely visible in the dim glow of a street lamp. She paced back and forth, as if debating her next move. Then slowly she stepped onto their property. Heart-pounding, Mr. Johnson shook his wife awake. "She's outside," he whispered. They watched in tense silence as Mrs. Parker crept toward their garage, fumbling with something in her hands. Then just as she reached for their car door handle, headlights flashed across the driveway. A vehicle rolled up, and out stepped David, their new neighbor from across the street. Mrs. Parker froze. David, who had been coming home late from work, caught her red-handed. He didn't say a word. He just pulled out his phone and started recording. Trapped Mrs. Parker stumbled backward, panic flashing across her face. She tried to act casual, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, I was just checking something. Thought I saw a stray cat." David raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "At midnight? On their property?" Her voice wavered. "It's none of your business." David didn't reply. He just kept the camera on her, letting the silence do all the talking. Then another porch light flicked on, and another. One by one, neighbors peeked outside, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Parker was no longer operating in the shadows. She was fully exposed. And she had no idea what was coming next. The street was silent, except for the distant hum of crickets and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Mrs. Parker stood frozen in the glare of the headlights, her face a mask of shock and desperation. She had spent years keeping her grip on the neighborhood, making sure people stayed in line. But now, under the watchful eyes of her neighbors, that grip was slipping fast. That just when she thought things couldn't get any worse, another voice cut through the night. "Is there a problem here?" It was Mr. Simmons, stepping onto his porch, his phone in hand. He wasn't the type to get involved in drama, but even he had reached his limit with Mrs. Parker's behavior. More neighbors emerged, drawn by the tension in the air. Mrs. Parker forced a laugh, though it sounded strained. "Of just a misunderstanding. I was." She glanced at David, who still had his phone recording, and then at the Johnsons' house. "I was just heading home." But no one was buying it. Just as she turned to leave, another light came on, this time from a patrol car creeping down the street. Someone had called the police. Maybe it was David, or maybe it was another neighbor watching from the shadows. Either way, Mrs. Parker stiffened as the car rolled to a stop right in front of her. A young officer stepped out, his expression unreadable as he scanned the scene. "We got a report about a trespasser," he said, looking directly at Mrs. Parker. "Mind explaining what you were doing here?" For the first time, real panic flickered in her eyes. She had always operated just under the radar, careful never to do anything that could get her into real trouble. But this was different. Before she could answer, Mr. Johnson stepped forward, holding up his phone. "We have security footage of her on our property, officer, and she's been harassing us for months." The officer's jaw tightened. "You have video evidence." David lifted his own phone. "And I caught her just now, trying to mess with their car." Mrs. Parker's mouth opened, then closed. She looked around, realizing that no one was stepping in to defend her. The same neighbors she had manipulated for years were now standing against her. But just as it seemed like her downfall was sealed, something unexpected happened. From down the street, a voice rang out. "Wait, I need to say something." It was Mrs. Thompson, the quiet woman from 2 houses down. She stepped forward, clutching something in her hand, an envelope yellowed with age. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "This has gone on long enough," she said, her voice uneven. Then turning to the officer, she held out the envelope. "You should see this. It might explain everything." The entire street fell silent. Even Mrs. Parker, who had been scrambling for a way out, stopped in her tracks. No one knew what was inside that envelope. But whatever it was about to change everything. The envelope trembled in Mrs. Thompson's hands as she stepped closer to the officer. The entire street seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what was inside. Even Mrs. Parker, who had been moments away. Mrs. Parker took a step back, her usual confidence shattered. For years, she had treated this neighborhood like it was hers to control. But the truth had finally caught up to her. The officer sighed. "We'll have to investigate this further, but if these documents hold up," he gave Mrs. Parker a pointed look, "you might not just be facing trespassing charges. You might be facing something much bigger." The street buzzed with quiet disbelief. The woman who had spent so much energy trying to drive others out might be the one who had no right to be there at all. Mrs. Parker's breath was shaky. "This is a mistake," she muttered, but there was no fight left in her voice. No threats, no false confidence. Just fear. The officer signaled for another patrol car, and as the flashing lights reflected against the houses, the truth settled over the neighborhood. Karma had arrived, and this time it wasn't leaving. As the second patrol car pulled up, the weight of the situation finally seemed to settle on Mrs. Parker's shoulders. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She just stood there, staring at the ground as the officer spoke to her quietly. The neighborhood, once a place where she held all the power, was now watching her downfall unfold in real time. The Johnsons stood together on their porch, feeling a strange mix of relief and disbelief. For so long, they had dealt with her harassment, wondering if they would ever see justice. And now, here it was, playing out before their eyes. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every person she had tried to intimidate, every neighbor she had made feel small. Mrs. Thompson wiped a tear from her cheek, her hands still shaking from the weight of what she had revealed. Mr. Coleman stood beside her, nodding solemnly. "Took long enough," he murmured. David and Lisa, the new neighbors, exchanged glances. "Guess we moved in at the right time," Lisa whispered. "I can't believe she's been getting away with this for years." "Not anymore," David replied. The officers continued speaking with Mrs. Parker, confirming details and asking her to come in for further questioning. She wasn't being arrested, not yet, but the investigation was officially underway. If the documents Mrs. Thompson had uncovered were legitimate, Mrs. Parker's life was